Brianna manipulated the quarterly numbers, Keith said, his voice carrying across the conference room with practiced confidence. I have the documentation right here. He slid a folder across the polished table toward our CEO, Patricia Thornton, while 12 board members watched in silence. My hands gripped the armrests of my chair, knuckles white beneath the mahogany surface. After 9 years of building Westfield Analytics from a struggling startup into a $20 million company, my assistant was accusing me of fraud. The irony burned hot in my chest. Keith had no idea what I knew. No idea about the security system I'd quietly upgraded 3 months ago. No idea that every keystroke, every file transfer, every late-night session in our shared office had been recorded in crystal-clear detail. Patricia's eyes met mine across the table, and I saw the question there. This was my moment to panic, to defend myself desperately. Instead, I smiled. Before we review Keith's documentation, I said calmly, perhaps we should look at the security footage from March 15th through April 2nd. My name is Brianna Montgomery, and I'm the Chief Financial Officer of Westfield Analytics. At 43, I'd spent nearly a decade transforming our financial operations from chaotic startup bookkeeping into systems that Fortune 500 companies envied. I'd hired Keith Paulson 2 years ago, fresh from business school with impressive credentials and even more impressive references. He was 26, ambitious, and eager to learn everything about corporate finance. I'd mentored him personally, sharing strategies I'd developed over 15 years in the industry. We worked late nights together, reviewed complex transactions side by side, and I'd even recommended him for 2 promotions. 6 months ago, Keith started asking pointed questions about our quarterly reporting process. How did I calculate certain adjustments? Which executives reviewed the numbers before board presentation? When did I finalize the reports? I'd answered everything openly because transparency was how I operated. Now, sitting in this emergency board meeting, I understood those questions differently. He'd been planning this for months. The meeting had started normally enough. Patricia opened with standard agenda items while I prepared to present our first quarter financial results. Westfield had exceeded projections by 18%, securing 3 major contracts that would carry us through the year. Then Keith raised his hand during the financial overview section. I need to report a serious concern, he'd announced, his expression troubled but determined. I've discovered inconsistencies in our quarterly budget reporting that I believe constitute financial misconduct. The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Board members shifted in their seats while Patricia's expression hardened into corporate crisis mode. Keith presented his case methodically. He showed spreadsheets with highlighted discrepancies, emails with suspicious timestamps, and calculations that appeared deliberately misleading. Everything pointed directly at me. His performance was convincing enough that 2 board members were already frowning in my direction. But I'd built something Keith fundamentally misunderstood. Trust wasn't just about relationships. It was about systems, verification, and documentation that couldn't be disputed. 3 months earlier, I'd noticed something odd during a routine file review. Several budget documents showed modification dates that didn't align with our standard workflow. Nothing dramatic, just timestamps that seemed off by a few hours here and there. I'd mentioned it casually to Keith, suggesting we review our file management protocols. He'd agreed enthusiastically, offering to help audit our systems. That conversation stuck with me, though. Something about his eagerness felt wrong. So I'd done something I'd never done before. I contacted our IT director, Trevor Walsh, about upgrading our security monitoring. Not because I suspected Keith specifically, but because protecting financial data was part of my responsibility. Trevor installed a comprehensive system that recorded all activity in the finance department. Screen captures, file access logs, email tracking, even security camera footage with timestamps synchronized to our network activity. Everything admissible in court if needed. I never told Keith about the upgrade. Never mentioned it to anyone except Patricia and our legal counsel, following proper corporate governance protocols. Now, watching Keith present his fabricated evidence, I felt oddly calm. The panic I should have experienced was replaced by cold calculation. Every document he showed had been altered. Every email timestamp had been changed. Every spreadsheet had been manipulated to make my legitimate work appear fraudulent. It was sophisticated enough to fool someone who didn't know our systems intimately. But I knew something Keith had overlooked. The security footage showed everything. His late-night sessions accessing my files. The USB drives he'd used to copy documents. The careful way he'd modified timestamps to create his false narrative. All of it captured in video that couldn't be disputed. These modifications happened on Brianna's computer, Keith continued, pointing to specific entries in his presentation. Using her login credentials during hours when only she had building access. The pattern is clear. Several board members nodded, their expressions grave. This was exactly the kind of financial impropriety that could destroy a company's reputation overnight. Patricia maintained her neutral expression, but I saw tension in her shoulders. Brianna, do you have a response to these allegations? Patricia asked, her voice professionally distant. This was the moment Keith expected me to scramble, to make excuses, to desperately defend myself against overwhelming evidence. Instead, I opened my laptop and connected it to the conference room display. I do, I said, pulling up a secure folder I'd prepared that morning after Keith requested this emergency meeting. But rather than debate document timestamps, I think we should examine the actual events Keith is describing. I clicked to the first video file, dated March 15th at 9:47 in the evening. The security footage showed our shared office, empty except for one person. Keith sat at my desk, using my computer. The timestamp in the corner matched exactly with the first discrepancy he'd highlighted in his presentation. This is from the night Keith claims I was manipulating budget figures, I explained calmly. As you can see, I wasn't in the building. Keith was using my workstation. The room went completely silent except for the soft hum of the display. Keith's face had gone pale, but he recovered quickly. Brianna gave me her login credentials to help with the quarterly review, he said smoothly. I was working on legitimate budget analysis that night. I nodded, anticipating this defense. That's interesting because I never gave you my credentials. In fact, corporate policy strictly prohibits sharing administrative access. I clicked to another file, this one showing Keith entering my office 2 weeks earlier, where he thought the building was empty. The video clearly captured him searching through my desk, finding the notebook where I kept backup passwords, and photographing several pages with his phone. This footage shows you obtaining my credentials without authorization, I continued. Which is not only a policy violation but potentially criminal under our data protection protocols. Patricia leaned forward, her expression shifting from neutral to intensely focused. The board members who'd been frowning at me were now staring at Keith with very different expressions. I had more. So much more. The next video showed Keith on March 22nd, working at his own computer with my files open in one window and Excel in another. The screen capture feature Trevor installed showed exactly what Keith was doing. Line by line, he was modifying budget entries, changing my legitimate calculations to create artificial discrepancies. The timestamps on his screen proved he was deliberately backdating the modifications to frame me. Here, you can see Keith altering the quarterly projections. I narrated, keeping my voice level and factual. Notice how he's changing figures that were already approved by our external auditors, then modifying the metadata to make it appear I made those changes during the original reporting period. Keith stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. This is fabricated, he said, his voice rising. Brianna is trying to cover her tracks by creating false evidence. But I wasn't finished. I pulled up an email chain, also captured by our monitoring system, showing Keith's correspondence with someone outside the company. The emails were devastating. Keith had been communicating with executives at Stratford Consulting, Westfield's largest competitor, for 6 months. The conversation was carefully coded, but the intent was clear. Keith was positioning himself as a whistleblower who would expose financial fraud at Westfield, creating chaos that Stratford could exploit. In exchange, they were offering him a senior position with a substantial salary increase. This email from April 1st shows Keith discussing the timeline for his allegations, I said, displaying the message on screen. He tells Stratford's VP of Finance that he'll have the board convinced of my misconduct within 2 weeks, creating an opportunity for them to poach our clients during the resulting instability. Patricia's expression had gone from focused to furious. Board members were whispering urgently to each other. Keith looked around the room desperately, realizing his carefully constructed plan was collapsing. "You hacked my email," he accused. "That's illegal." I shook my head. "All company email is monitored per our acceptable use policy, which you signed when you started employment. Nothing illegal about reviewing communications on company systems." The final piece of evidence was almost beautiful in its simplicity. I pulled up Keith's own document trail, showing how he'd researched methods for manipulating financial data without detection. His browser history, captured by our monitoring system, included searches for how to change file timestamps, covering tracks in Excel, and creating plausible deniability in financial fraud cases. He'd even visited forums where people discussed framing colleagues for workplace misconduct. The irony was staggering. Keith had researched everything except whether the company he was betraying had security systems capable of catching him. The complete evidence package has been reviewed by our legal counsel and external auditors, I concluded. Everything you've seen today is documented, verified, and admissible. Keith's allegations are fabricated, and his actions constitute fraud, corporate espionage, and attempted destruction of my professional reputation. I closed my laptop and looked directly at Keith. His face had gone from pale to gray, sweat visible on his forehead despite the conference room's climate control. The ambitious assistant who'd walked in expecting to destroy my career now faced the destruction of his own. Patricia stood, her voice cutting through the shocked silence. "Keith Paulson, you're terminated effective immediately. Security will escort you from the building. You'll receive formal notification of our legal action against you by end of business today." 2 security guards who'd been waiting outside entered the room. Keith looked around desperately, searching for any support, any sympathy. He found none. "This isn't fair," he said, his voice cracking. "Brianna manipulated you all. She's covering up her own crimes." But nobody was listening anymore. The evidence was too clear, too comprehensive, too damning. As security escorted him out, Keith shot me one final look of pure hatred. I felt no satisfaction in his downfall, only a weary relief that the threat had been neutralized. The door closed behind him, and the conference room erupted in urgent conversation. Board members demanded to know how this had happened, how someone could get so close to destroying the company's reputation. Patricia raised her hand, calling for silence. "Brianna, walk us through your security protocols." I explained the monitoring system I'd implemented, emphasizing that it followed all legal requirements and company policies. Everything was documented, nothing violated privacy laws, and the system existed precisely to prevent the kind of fraud Keith had attempted. "Why didn't you mention these suspicions earlier?" one board member asked. It was a fair question. "Because I didn't have suspicions," I replied honestly. "I noticed some irregular file timestamps during routine reviews and upgraded our security as a precautionary measure. Standard risk management. I never imagined my own assistant was planning something this elaborate." Patricia nodded approvingly. She'd known about the security upgrade because I'd cleared it through proper channels, but she hadn't known why until this morning when I'd briefed her privately before the board meeting. "The real question," another board member said, "is how we prevent this from happening again. If Keith could get this far, what's stopping others?" It was a valid concern, and I had prepared recommendations. Over the next hour, we discussed comprehensive changes to our internal controls. Mandatory rotation of sensitive responsibilities, enhanced background checks for finance positions, and additional oversight on document access. The board approved everything I suggested, along with a formal audit of all financial records to verify nothing else had been compromised. As the meeting concluded, Patricia asked me to stay behind. When the room cleared, she poured 2 glasses of water and sat down heavily. "I'm sorry, Brianna," she said quietly. "You shouldn't have had to defend yourself against something this malicious." I appreciated her sentiment, but the reality was more complex. "Actually, this revealed a weakness in our systems," I said. "Keith got as far as he did because we trusted without verifying. That's on me as much as anyone." Patricia shook her head firmly. You identified the vulnerability and fixed it before it caused real damage. That's exactly what we pay you to do. She paused, studying me carefully. How did you know to prepare this defense? Keith only requested the emergency meeting this morning. I'd been expecting this question. Keith has been acting strangely for 2 weeks, I explained. Asking odd questions about board procedures, timing of financial reviews, things outside his normal responsibilities. Yesterday, I reviewed the security footage and saw what he'd been doing. When he requested this meeting, I knew what was coming. Patricia absorbed this information, then smiled slightly. You let him walk into a trap. It wasn't quite accurate, but close enough. I documented everything and prepared to defend myself with facts. The trap was his own making. I just made sure the truth would be clear. We sat in silence for a moment, processing the magnitude of what had almost happened. If I hadn't upgraded the security systems, if I hadn't noticed those irregular timestamps, Keith's plan might have worked. The board might have believed his fabricated evidence, destroyed my reputation, and created exactly the chaos Stratford Consulting wanted. The company I'd spent 9 years building would have been severely damaged, possibly destroyed. All because one ambitious assistant decided betrayal was faster than earning success honestly. That evening, I sat in my office long after everyone else had gone home. The security footage of Keith's escort from the building played on my monitor, not out of vindictiveness, but as a reminder. Trust was essential in business, but blind trust was dangerous. I'd trusted Keith because he seemed competent and eager. I'd shared knowledge generously because that's how I believed mentorship worked. But I'd failed to verify that trust with appropriate systems and oversight. That failure almost cost me everything. My phone rang, displaying an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won. Brianna Montgomery, I said. Miss Montgomery, this is Detective Holland from the Commercial Crimes Division. A professional voice replied. We've received a complaint from Keith Paulson alleging corporate misconduct at Westfield Analytics. I'd like to schedule a time to discuss this with you. So, Keith was escalating, trying to create legal complications even after his termination. I'd anticipated this possibility too. Of course, Detective. I have comprehensive documentation of the situation, including security footage and communications records. When would you like to meet? The detective arrived the next morning with a colleague, both wearing expressions of professional skepticism. I'd prepared a conference room with our legal counsel, full documentation, and the complete video evidence package. Let's start with Mr. Paulson's allegations, Detective Holland began, opening a notebook. He claims you've been manipulating company finances and have now fabricated evidence to frame him. I nodded calmly. I understand. Before we discuss his claims, I'd like to show you what actually happened. Over the next 90 minutes, I walked them through everything. The timeline of Keith's activities, the security footage showing his unauthorized access, the emails proving his collaboration with competitors, and the detailed evidence of how he'd manufactured his false allegations. Both detectives took extensive notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When I finished, Detective Holland sat back and sighed. This is one of the more sophisticated attempted fraud cases I've seen, he said. Mr. Paulson clearly put significant planning into this scheme. His colleague nodded in agreement. The question now is whether you want to press charges. I've been considering this decision since Keith's termination. Pressing charges would mean public attention, potential media coverage, and weeks or months of legal proceedings. It would also send a clear message that corporate fraud carried serious consequences. What are the potential charges? I asked. Detective Holland consulted his notes. Fraud, corporate espionage, identity theft for using your credentials, possibly conspiracy if we can prove coordination with Stratford Consulting. Combined, we're looking at significant penalties, potentially including prison time. The detective's words hung heavy in the air. Keith was 26 years old. A criminal conviction would destroy his career permanently. But he'd been willing to destroy mine without hesitation, and his actions had put the entire company at risk. I need to discuss this with our CEO and legal team, I said. Can I have 24 hours? Detective Holland agreed, leaving his card and taking copies of our evidence. After they left, I sat alone in the conference room, wrestling with a decision I never expected to face. Revenge would be easy. Keith deserved consequences. But was destroying his future the right choice? Patricia made the decision easier that afternoon. "We're pressing charges," she said firmly when I outlined the situation. This wasn't a mistake or poor judgment. Keith planned a deliberate scheme to commit fraud and destroy you professionally. Companies like Westfield can't function if employees believe they can get away with that behavior. She was right, though it didn't make the decision feel better. "What about the publicity?" I asked. "This could get messy." Patricia smiled grimly. "Let it get messy. We have nothing to hide, and the truth is completely on our side. Besides, other companies need to know what Keith tried. He shouldn't be able to just move to another job and try this again." We drafted a statement for the press, outlining the basics without compromising the investigation. Within hours, local business media picked up the story. By evening, it had spread to national outlets. The narrative was compelling. Trusted assistant betrays mentor, gets caught by security systems, faces criminal charges. Several reporters requested interviews, which I declined on advice of counsel. The legal proceedings moved faster than expected. Keith's attorney tried negotiating a settlement where charges would be dropped in exchange for a confession and restitution. Our legal team rejected it immediately. This wasn't about money. It was about accountability. 3 weeks after his termination, Keith was formally charged with multiple counts of fraud and corporate espionage. The evidence was so overwhelming that his attorney advised him to plead guilty in exchange for a reduced sentence. He refused, apparently convinced he could still convince a jury that I'd framed him. The trial lasted 4 days. Prosecutors presented our security footage, email records, and testimony from forensic IT experts who verified nothing had been manipulated. Keith's defense argued that I'd orchestrated an elaborate setup to destroy an assistant who discovered my own misconduct. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Keith received 2 years in prison, 5 years probation, and was ordered to pay restitution to Westfield for the costs of investigating his fraud. Sitting in the courtroom as the verdict was read, I felt no triumph. Just a hollow awareness that this entire situation could have been avoided if Keith had chosen differently. If he'd focused on building his career honestly instead of trying to shortcut his way to success by destroying mine. After the trial, several media outlets wanted to interview me about the case. I agreed to one, hoping to share lessons that might help other companies avoid similar situations. "What would you say to other executives about protecting themselves?" the reporter asked. I thought carefully about my response. Trust your people, but verify that trust with proper systems. Not because you assume everyone is dishonest, but because good systems protect honest people and expose those who aren't. I got lucky. I happened to upgrade our security just before Keith's plan advanced. Most people won't be that fortunate. The interview ran in several business publications, generating discussion about corporate security and employee oversight. Some people criticized our monitoring systems as invasive. Others praised them as necessary protection. 6 months after Keith's conviction, Westfield Analytics had fully recovered from the incident. We'd implemented stronger internal controls, enhanced our security monitoring, and developed better protocols for identifying potential insider threats. But the real change was cultural. Employees understood that the company took fraud seriously, that attempted misconduct would be caught and punished, and that we had systems in place to protect innocent people from false allegations. I'd received calls from 3 other companies asking about our security protocols. Apparently, Keith's case had highlighted how vulnerable most organizations were to insider fraud. I shared what I could, hoping others could learn from our experience without having to go through it themselves. My own role at Westfield expanded. Patricia promoted me to Chief Operating Officer, overseeing not just finance but all operational systems. The board's confidence in me had actually increased after seeing how I'd handled Keith's betrayal. Strange how nearly being destroyed professionally had led to greater opportunities. One afternoon, I received a letter from Keith. Prison mail, forwarded through our legal department with a note asking if I wanted to read it. Curiosity won. The letter was surprisingly honest. Keith admitted he'd been motivated by impatience and greed, wanting the success I'd earned without putting in the years of work it required. He apologized for trying to destroy my reputation and acknowledged he'd made terrible choices. The letter ended with a question that stuck with me. Did you know what I was planning the whole time? Or did you just get lucky with a security upgrade? I considered responding, but ultimately decided against it. Keith needed to focus on rehabilitation, not on understanding exactly when I'd caught him. The answer didn't matter anyway. What mattered was that proper systems and procedures had worked exactly as designed. 3 months later, Stratford Consulting faced their own investigation. Prosecutors had used our evidence to examine their role in Keith's scheme. Several executives were charged with conspiracy and corporate espionage. Apparently, Keith hadn't been their first attempt at recruiting insider informants. The case became a teaching example in business schools, illustrating both the importance of corporate security and the consequences of fraud. I was invited to speak at several universities about risk management and internal controls. Standing in front of rooms full of eager business students, I emphasized the same message. Success built on integrity would always outlast success built on deception. The shortcuts that seemed appealing in the moment created risks that compounded over time. Keith had thrown away a promising career for what he thought was a faster path to advancement. Now he sat in prison while his former colleagues continued building their careers honestly. Some students asked if I felt guilty about Keith's imprisonment. It was a fair question that I'd asked myself many times. I feel sad about the choices he made, I'd reply. But I don't feel guilty about the consequences. He had every opportunity to succeed legitimately. He chose fraud instead. The responsibility for what happened to him rests entirely on his own decisions. The speaking engagements led to consulting opportunities with companies wanting to strengthen their internal controls. 2 years after Keith's conviction, Westfield Analytics had grown to $40 million in annual revenue. We'd doubled our client base, expanded into 3 new markets, and earned industry recognition for our corporate governance practices. The incident that nearly destroyed us had ultimately made us stronger. I still worked long hours, still mentored young professionals, still believed in sharing knowledge generously. But I did it with better systems in place, with verification procedures that protected everyone involved, and with a clear understanding that trust without accountability created opportunities for those willing to exploit it. Patricia announced her retirement at our annual meeting, recommending me as her replacement. The board voted unanimously to approve. At 45, I became CEO of the company I'd helped build from near bankruptcy into a thriving business. Keith's attempt to destroy me had failed. The security systems I'd implemented had worked perfectly. Justice had been served. But more importantly, I'd learned that protecting yourself didn't mean becoming cynical or suspicious. It meant creating transparent systems that made honesty easy and fraud difficult. On my first day as CEO, I found a package on my desk. Inside was the notebook Keith had photographed to steal my credentials, returned by the prosecutor's office now that the case was closed. I'd forgotten about it entirely. The notebook contained years of handwritten notes, calculations, and strategies I'd developed during late nights solving complex financial problems. Looking through those pages, I realized what Keith had never understood. Success wasn't about having the right passwords or access to the right files. It was about developing expertise through years of hard work, building relationships through consistent integrity, and creating value that couldn't be stolen because it existed in knowledge and character rather than documents. I locked the notebook in my desk drawer, not because it contained secrets worth protecting, but because it represented something Keith could never take from me. The years of dedication, the problems solved, the lessons learned, all of it had led to this moment. Keith Paulson had tried to destroy me with lies. Instead, he'd proven that truth, properly documented and transparently presented, was the strongest defense possible. As I looked out my new office window at the city below, I felt grateful for the security systems that had saved my career and the lesson they'd taught. In business and in life, trust was essential, but verification was wisdom.